It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, there's a story it's a sad story. It's out of the Des Moines Register. It has to do with an Iowa-born soldier, and we've got a unique perspective on it from our old buddy, our old pal, Matthew Hoh, who has a personal connection to this, which I was unaware of until I shared it with him, and he said he'd be happy to come on the podcast to talk about it, and let's welcome him on in. Matthew Hoh, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on.
You know, for folks that are maybe just catching up to podcast by George and haven't seen Matt on the show before, I'll give this little brief bio. Now, Matt spent nearly 12 years in America's wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, and State Department. He's a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. That's going back to 2010. And he was on the news a lot here recently because in 2009, Matthew resigned his post in protest in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. And of course, it looks like we're finally going to kind of maybe get out of Afghanistan in a lot of ways come September. In 2010, Matthew was named the Ridenour Prize recipient for truth-telling, and in 2020, he was awarded as a Defender of Liberty by the Committee for the Republic. He's a 100% disabled veteran. He's been certified by North Carolina as a peer support specialist for mental health and substance abuse disorders, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start off reading this article, and then we'll get to it with Matt. The article in the Register reads, Brandon Ketchum's family is grateful to Iowa's members of Congress who have not forgotten the tragic way he died almost 5 years ago. All four of Iowa's U.S. House members are supporting the Sergeant Ketchum Rural Veterans Mental Health Act, which was discussed in a hearing Thursday. Okay, that's the first paragraph, and people that watch my podcast know that I pay special attention to every single word. Now, this is supposed to be a feel-good story to a certain extent. It's supposed to make you feel good about the members of Congress as well. Matt, I got to tell you, I look at this open, and I think, yeah, but you know, all four, now that it's changed because of the election, but all four members of Iowa's congressional delegation voted to extend that war in Afghanistan last year, and they also just voted unanimously to increase defense spending, the Pentagon budget, which is, you know, right out in the open, and we've talked about this, you and I, before, close to $1 trillion. And I look at this and say, if they really want to help, if they really want to honor this kid, they do something about the circumstances around the globe that are killing people like him.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you go further in the article, and I think that this bill appropriates $1.2 million,
yes,
which is nothing, absolutely nothing. I mean, again, actually, according to my colleague at the Center for International Policy, Bill Hartung, who, the defense industry hates Bill. Like, no joke, he's written entire books about Lockheed Martin but you know, according to Bill and in the work he's done, it's about $1.25 trillion every year that is spent on the military, wars, veterans, nuclear weapons. The State Department, you know, the primary purpose of the State Department these days is really to sell weapons overseas. The embassies function as mechanisms for commerce, but more and more, particularly starting under President Obama, the embassies have really been functioning as conduits for weapon sales. The United States dominates world arms sales. We export hundreds of billions of dollars. It is sadly one of the largest exports the United States has is weapon sales. You know, we have others, agriculture, you know, automobiles, whatever, but also to weapons. But, you know, you look at that $1.2 million that they appropriated, that's nothing. I mean, $1.2 million does hardly anything for anybody, as well as they want to form a committee to study this problem. We know what the problem is. There's not enough resources. We also know that the VA, which has about 350,000 employees, has about 50,000 vacancies and have had 50,000 vacancies for years now. This is a problem that predates Trump. This is a problem that was under Obama, a problem that was under Bush. the VA, the Congress, and the executive have refused to fill these vacancies. A lot of it is because, look, the VA is the second largest federal agency after the Department of Defense, which gets $750 billion directly. The VA gets more than $200 billion directly. It is a cash cow that, these same legislators that say, oh, the poor veterans, they're killing themselves, we should do something to remember Sergeant Ketchum, honor his family, et cetera. They're the same ones who are not holding the VA accountable and saying, look, why are 1 in 7 of your positions not being filled? I mean, that's part of the problem, is the resources are just not being allocated the way they need to be allocated. And then this is a real problem too for people who live in rural areas, who it might take, or even not rural areas. Look, when I lived in Washington, D.C. or in Northern Virginia, I was 7 or 8 miles from the VA, and it would take me an hour and a half to get there each way because of traffic.
Yeah.
Right. So, right. I mean, so you also have those issues too. If you live in an urban area, the VA may be on the other side of the city from you, and it may take you a good portion of your day. And so for men and women who are working jobs, have families and everything, it may not be possible, particularly if you have chronic problems, if you have physical problems that require physical therapy where you're going weekly, or if you have mental health problems that require weekly therapy. What job allows you to miss a day of work, right, every week to go to these? The VA does not offer mental health services on the weekends. It does not offer mental health services early in the morning, like at say 6 a.m. or something like that. It does not offer mental health services after 4:30 p.m. on the weekdays, right? So, I mean, there's a lot that you don't need to form a committee to understand what a lot of these problems are. I mean, and we do know, one of the things we do know in suicide among veterans is, we can get into all the data and the facts on that. But one thing we do know is that veterans who are receiving consistent mental health care have a much lower probability of killing themselves than those who are not receiving health care. It's very, very clear. The evidence is all there. If you are in VA healthcare, the likelihood of you committing suicide is still high, but it's not nearly as high as you being killed by suicide if you are not in VA healthcare.
My God. Let me pick up this article here and read the next couple of paragraphs. And I almost hesitated to forward this to Matt because I know this is very painful for you. And this particular story is especially painful. Now, the bill that Matt's talking about, it honors Brandon Ketchum. He's a Davenport, Iowa native. He died by suicide in 2016 after being denied inpatient psychiatric care at the Iowa City Veterans Administration Medical Center. Ketchum's mother, Beverly Hoh, said this week that she was proud to see his name attached to the bill. Brandon has the biggest heart. He always made sure others got what they needed before he got anything for himself. Hoh said in a phone interview from her home in Wisconsin. Now, here's the crux of the situation. The VA hospital turned Ketchum away. He was 33 years old, a veteran of the Marine Corps and the Iowa National Guard. He served 2 deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. And that's a part of the problem also. 2 deployments in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder and drug abuse, for which he sought care. In July 2016, he went to the Iowa City VA hospital where he asked to be admitted. A psychiatrist there determined inpatient care wasn't needed for Ketchum, who then left the facility and drove home to Davenport. That night, he took his own life. And like I said, Matt, that's painful to even read or hear about, but it's a story that you've probably heard way too often.
Yeah, there are many stories like that of veterans who, for whatever reason. And, the problem is you're dealing with young men and women because suicide rates among female veterans are very high, much, much higher than anything we see in the female in the population of women. Suicide rates among male veterans are much higher. You're looking at the general, just to go to the data, at the general veteran population, all veterans, the 8 million veterans in this country, whether they've World War II or Iraq or peacetime, if you are a veteran, you have a 1.5 greater chance of death by suicide than a non-veteran.
Oh.
You pull that apart, though, and you look at veterans who have been deployed, the suicide rate goes up. You look at veterans who have been in combat, and the suicide rate goes up exponentially. And that's the case for veterans of all wars. Doesn't matter if it was a good war or a bad war. We know that after the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans on both sides died by suicide, died from opiate or opiate overdose, alcoholism, exposure, because they were homeless, hundreds of thousands. The thought is that possibly as many veterans of suicide, many veterans of the Civil War died prematurely after the war as did during the war. I mean, that's a startling number when you think about that. 700,000 died during the war, and that possibly as many died post-war in the decades after the war because of, again, suicide, homelessness, alcoholism, overdose. We see the same things after World War I, same things after World War II. World War II veterans who are in their 80s and 90s are killing themselves at a rate 4 times higher than their civilian peers. So if you were a World War II veteran, someone compared to someone who did not go to war, who's your same age, falls in the same demographic category, your likelihood of death by suicide is 4 times greater. For the youngest veterans of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we see rates of suicide ranging from 4 times to 10 times higher than their civilian peers, depending upon age and sex. So, I mean, the numbers are just really startling. And what you have is you could have a case where someone like Brandon Ketchum goes to get help, and and he's in his mental and his emotional state is dire. So what could have even occurred there could have just been something that was not negligence. Nothing was meant by it. Whatever. He could have been a miscommunication, anything. But the problem is you're dealing with people who are dealing with severe mental and emotional distress. And so the perception of being turned away, when maybe that wasn't even the case. I think in Ketchum's case it was, but even the perception of it is going to do damage and can cause that final push, because that's what you see a lot of times is it's a final break with men and women who are dealing with suicidality, is that there's some kind of final break where something occurs, a relationship ends, a job is lost, you're turned away from the VA, and that's it. You just do not have the strength to do it any longer, and you end up losing, and you're killed by suicide. My connection with Brandon Ketchum is that when I was a captain in the Marine Corps, one of my lieutenants was later on I believe it would have been Sergeant Ketchum's second deployment to Iraq. He was his platoon commander. So Ethan was Brandon's platoon commander. So I know him through Ethan, and Ethan thought the world of him. That's one of these things about these wars, George, that I think we don't discuss enough. A guy named E.B. Sledge wrote this great book about World War II called With the Old Breed. And literally every other page, Sledge he uses this phrase, "What a waste." He's talking about all the people that are killed. And that's Sledge's thing. Sledge goes on after the war to become a doctor, but Sledge talks about this, about what could have all these young men who we slaughtered on both sides could have become. And in the case of Brandon Ketchum's case, the way that Ethan talked about him, the way that Ethan relied upon him, how capable this young man was, how, just how everyone loved him, but also too how capable he was. What could he have done with his life if not for these wars? What would have become of him? What would he have done with his life for his, not just for himself, but for his family, his neighbors, his community? What could he, and that's what when you look at the cost of these wars, when you look at the fact that you have 20% of the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have traumatic brain injury. Another 20% also have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is completely debilitating. what could they have done? What does that mean for their family, their friends, their communities, their neighbors, et cetera? The cost is incalculable. And unfortunately, because we do have a large country, 330 million people, only 2.7 million have been to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of it is in communities that are in rural areas, or they are in urban areas. And what we also are tending to see is that the young men and women who are joining are the children, the grandchildren, the cousins of people who are already joining the military, who have already joined the military. So it's become even more insular, and the majority of our country just is not exposed to what these wars actually mean in terms of the effect they have on people.
Well, those are all excellent points, and I think about that as well. What could they have done for themselves? What could they have done for their families and communities? What could they have done for us? Because Matt and I could sit here all day with this podcast and enumerate issues, any number of which can't be solved. We can't figure it out. We can't get to the bottom of it. Well, maybe some of these people that have died unnecessarily in these wars, and from my generation, Vietnam would be at the top of the list, maybe they would have had the solution, but we'll never know because they're no longer with us. Well, this is the Sergeant Ketchum Rural Veterans Mental Health Act. The last thing I wanted you to comment here on, Matt, because I know you have personal experience with this, and the article reads that Representative Cindy Axney recounted how Ketchum's service in Iraq included helping clear 92 roadside bombs in 7 months. Like many veterans, he suffered mental health and drug abuse issues afterward, she said. Well, okay, there was a movie made about that called The Hurt Locker, where clearing these roadside bombs. And, Matt, my own personal experience, growing up, still knew World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans, and everybody knows this. If they have a family member or a friend that was involved in the war, they don't generally like to talk about it. And it's kind of American ethos to think, well, they don't like to talk about it because they're like John Wayne. They're brave. They're stoic. Yeah. They want to protect us from having to hear about the horrors of war. Yeah, there's some of that, I think. But I think most of it is they don't want to revisit it in their mind's eye, the horror of war, because of what it does to them. And if you're clearing 92 roadside bombs in 7 months, that stress that you carry around inside of you, my God, I can't imagine, Matt.
There's so much to it, George. It's exactly that. There's a little bit of bravado, probably. A lot of it is, I think, people we feel like people aren't going to understand. How can anyone get that? And we just don't want to get drawn into a conversation about it. We don't want to relive it. There's all those parts to it. There's as many... I think, to be fair, probably as many explanations as there are guys and gals who've gone through it. That's one of the aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder, is that your body is still in survival mode, that those chemicals that your body produces in times of emergency, the adrenaline, the cortisol, et cetera, that is was meant for our ancestors to fight the saber-toothed tiger that came into the cave, right? When you're in Iraq, you're in Afghanistan, you're in Vietnam, you are there for 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, a year. Some guys were there for 15 months. I just saw a statistic that there have been 30,000 veterans of the Afghan war that deployed to Afghanistan more than 5 times. 30,000. Right? I mean, it's just, so when you're there for that period of time, you're hunting other people every day. Other people are hunting you every day. And that PTSD that develops is because your limbic system, your fight or flight or freeze system, it gets broken, right? I mean, it's not supposed to be used every day. And so that valve that produces the adrenaline and cortisol and everything else gets stuck open. So that's why you have this hypervigilance, this hyper startle response. You're always on guard. You're always expecting something to occur because those chemicals are going through you. But I can tell you, yeah, I mean, we did the same work, and Sergeant Ketchum was there. That would have been I think when that deployment would have occurred, that would have been in 2007 when violence had dropped significantly in Iraq, and he still cleared 92 IEDs in 7 months. When we were there, I don't even know how many of my guys did. We did a lot. We had so many IEDs explode on our vehicles. I had Marines that had more than 10 roadside bomb blasts against their vehicles. And when we came home, there was no screening for traumatic brain injury. So you're in these vehicles that protect you, that literally all of us have stories of where we would have been killed in previous wars, but because our vehicle armor and our body armor is so good now, we survive these things. We walk away from them. The problem is your brain gets rattled inside your head, causes traumatic brain injury. You then come home and there's a latent onset a lot of times with that injury where it doesn't develop for 10, 15, 20 years. So when we came home, went back to 29 Palms in California, the Marine Corps base, they sent up a team from the hospital at Camp Pendleton. My first sergeant and I, again, we have Marines who have been blown up more than 10 times. We didn't know who to send to this thing. No one had given us guidance. I was a captain. He was a first sergeant. We didn't know. So we decided that if any of our Marines, if any of the 153 Marines that we had and sailors that we had, if any of them felt not well, they would go, right? Go see the TBI doctors, the brain injury doctors. And these Marines and sailors who volunteered to go to Iraq, none of them are going to say that they don't feel well, right? So that's a wash. So then we decide if you were blown up, we picked a number, 5 times or more. Right? Then you have to go see. And what happens then, those Marines and sailors, which were there are a bunch of them, and then there are others of us who are only blown up once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, whatever, we don't have to go. But so we say, they sit down and a doctor says, how are you feeling? And that young man says, I feel fine. And then that's it. And so you have we're walking away from these blasts that, the effects occur much like the football. It's similar, but it's different than what the football players are going through. So there's a latent onset where you start to see the problems develop 10, 15, 20 years afterwards. And a lot of us don't know what's happening to us. In my case, when the TBI sets in, I don't know what it is. All of a sudden I'm having migraines, all of a sudden I'm having this fatigue that is just completely debilitating. I am having cognitive dysfunction. I can't use my computer anymore. The VA had to put me through a 6-month program so I could learn how to do all kinds of things over again, just as if I had a stroke, right? I mean, because your brain stops working the way it had been. And, I was fortunate that I had people around me who recognized the problem and were able to guide me. A lot of guys don't have that. A lot of gals don't have that. And so you need, getting back to what we were originally talking about, resources, and if you're then, if on top of TBI, most of us are also dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we haven't even talked about moral injury, which is the guilt, the shame, the regret that comes from war, in which what the studies have shown, the VA has known since 1991 that combat-related guilt is the best predictor of suicide in veterans. We know this. I mean, this is all very debilitating. Then you have the substance abuse, right? Then you have the depression and the anger that are secondary effects of all these things. You have the despondency, you have the loneliness because you've destroyed your relationships, you've alienated your family, you've lost your job, nobody wants to hang out with you. You don't want to hang out with anyone because you want to avoid. I mean, and it just, right, as anyone can understand, it becomes a cycle. And then you have, I don't know his circumstances, but that's how you can imagine how Brandon Ketchum ends up at the VA one day. He's been dealing with a heroin addiction. He's been dealing with the consequences of 3 deployments. He gets turned away, and that unfortunately was too much for him at that point. And he's no longer with us and has been gone for 5 years now. His family's lost him, and everyone who knew him says he's the best guy you'd ever meet, right? And multiply that times all the others that have been killed by suicide, because all of them are the best guys or best gals you've ever met. And they're lost, right?
They are. And we're out of time. I hate to be too contrarian. I hate to be too negative, because outwardly this would appear to be a good story. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you read this and then you find out that it's $1.2 million per year and it's voted in support by people that are supporting the war and actually being in Afghanistan. So, and it's not my world, Matt. So it's hard for me to comment on it. It is your world. So in lieu of that, this $1.2 million Band-Aid per year, this bill on a huge wound. What would you like to see? What would be top of your list of what we could and should do to treat this situation?
Well, I think in terms of is appropriate resourcing, right? Again, the VA has up to 50,000 staff vacancies. Fill those vacancies. The other thing too is the handoff between the Department of Defense and the VA needs to be completely uninterrupted. And right now that it's gotten better, certainly than it was 10 years ago, but there's still this dissonance, this disruption that occurs. You know, a Marine, a sailor, a soldier, airman, whoever should not be allowed to leave the military without having to go to the VA, be registered, meet with all kinds of doctors there. We bring a young man or woman into the military. We spend millions of dollars training them. If you're a young man, you join the Marine Corps, you're going to go to 13 weeks of boot camp. Then you're going to go to at least 6 weeks. I don't even know, it might be 10 weeks now of infantry training. And right, I mean, we spend all this time conditioning them, getting them prepared to kill. They spend all that time when they're in the service, continuing to train. And then when they leave, they go to a couple of days of classes. It's gotten much better than it was. I mean, we came back from Iraq and literally we got like a day and a half of PowerPoint classes, you know, and that was it, you know, so it's gotten better than that. But why can't we do a reverse boot camp? Send these kids, and because they're mostly kids, right? They're in their early 20s, send them to these reverse boot camps. That would help so much with, you know, in terms of at least giving them and letting them understand what resources are out there, teaching them about these things, you know, and then also too, forming those connections so that they know where to get help. That would be so much, and that would cost a fraction of probably what we are spending on lifetime health care for veterans.
I like it. I mean, that's a great idea. I mean, it's good for them. It's good for us. I mean, honest to God, and we owe it to them if you want to look at it in that context. Well, as I mentioned, we're out of time. Matt, I will call on you again here soon. I wish there wasn't news like this to cover, but that's the nature of news. And thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Thanks, George.
Folks, that's Matthew Hoh, a frequent guest on Podcast by George. He's our expert on military matters, the situation in Afghanistan, PTSD, and stories, tragic stories like this. And I hope you like Podcast by George. If you do, go to podcastbygeorge.com and pick the platform that you'd like to follow us on. You can get us on iTunes in audio form, but we're also on YouTube and video. Also, Facebook is where you can see the videos. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.